Just imagine how cool would it be to own a single plane that can easily carry 5 people in a spacious cabin, is very rugged, can take off or land in short distances, allows you to fly aerobatics, and yet is stable enough for long flights. And best of all, is powered by a classic radial engine. Yes, this plane exists. Ladies and gentlemen, the Piper. Sorry, wrong plane. Name another plane that can haul your family around, get flipped around the sky, and draw all the attention on the parking ramp. Go ahead, I'll give you a minute. And while you're busy thinking, you'll be happy to know that this amazing little machine from Russia can be yours for way less than you think. Remember that. But before we get into that, let's take a step back and learn about this plane's fascinating history. Way back in the 40s, right after World War II, the Soviet Union badly needed a plane to train pilots for its growing aviation industry. Yakovlev was a successful company who supplied many fighter planes during the war and stepped up to the plate to build a new trainer. The Yak-18 first flew in 1946 and was a huge hit. Many variations of the Yak-18 appeared, and the plane was even copied in China. The hard-working Yak-18 trained thousands of pilots across Russia for more than 20 years. Russian flag carrier Aeroflot was also growing and needed to hire more pilots, but they felt the Yak-18 was a little too crude and not advanced enough to prepare pilots for their equipment, especially when you consider the lack of instrumentation. Furthermore, tandem seating is better suited for training fighter pilots. Side-by-side seating is what you need to fly an airliner. So once again, Yakovlev rolled up their sleeves and rolled out the 18T in 1967. In spite of the name, the Yak-18 and the 18T really had nothing in common. In place of the simple tandem cockpit, the 18T could carry 5 people in a spacious cabin. It also featured a high-tech cockpit, well, at least for the time, and most notably, a tricycle landing gear. Once a student pilot wrapped up their training on the 18T, they were qualified to fly as a co-pilot on the Antonov 24 turboprop, or the Yak-40 airliner. It's no coincidence the 18T shared as much of the instrumentation as larger jets its students would eventually move up to. The 18T taught its students everything from basic airmanship all the way to complex maneuvers required during advanced training. Aeroflot finally had the advanced trainer they needed, and around 700 were built. The Russian government also loved the 18T, and it was eventually used in a myriad of missions far beyond training. Air transport, air ambulance, aerial photography, pipeline patrol, and just about any other role they could think of. Yak-18Ts were flown across Russia and other Eastern Bloc countries, in all sorts of weather and on runways barely suitable for jeeps. And that was the beauty of this plane. It got beat up by student pilots while operating at dirt strips in the countryside, all day long. In Russian flight schools, students received spin training, and the aircraft had to endure abuse by ham-fisted pilots day in and day out. And this is one of the reasons why the 18T was so overbuilt compared to its peers. The cherry on the cake is that it can handle 5 positive Gs and negative 2.5 Gs. It takes a licking and keeps on ticking. A stroke of genius was a commonality with other Yak models. For example, a lot of the parts from the 18T were interchangeable with the Yak-52, its smaller sibling that was built in much larger numbers. The heart and soul of the 18T is the Veneniev M14P radial engine. Though it was designed in the 1940s, it powered pretty much all general aviation aircraft that came out of Russia, and the 18T was no exception. This rugged little engine is reliable and easy to repair. At some point in the 1980s, the Russian government decided the 18T was getting a little long in the tooth and decided to replace it with the Let L410 Turbolet, a rather odd choice considering how different these two aircraft were. And equally as unbelievable, the government deemed the poor aircraft as useless and obsolete. So they started scrapping all the 18Ts, and it's estimated about half the fleet turned into soda cans. Fortunately, this madness ended with the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the 18T became a hot commodity with collectors around the world and can be found on almost every continent. Even though it was built throughout the 1980s, it has a classic charm that no other light transport can match. The rounded tail looks straight off of a Yak fighter from World War II, which reveals its warbird pedigree. This is a plane that you can easily park in the middle of the other warbirds at an air show and no one will bat an eye. Unlike some planes that squat low to the ground, the 18T sits tall on its long landing gear. The wings are built in two sections, with a flat inner panel made of aluminum, and the outer wings that are covered in fabric are bent up at an angle. This peculiar wing shape makes it both very responsive in turns and yet is very stable in level flight. The ailerons are very wide and cover the full extension of the outer wings, rendering it very sensitive in roll. As far as the retractable landing gear, it had a couple of clever methods to let you know that your gear was up or down. In front of the windshield, as well as each wing, you'll find a tiny rod sticking out, and this will tell you that the gear is down. In addition to that, many were equipped with 3 small lights on each landing strut. This is a way for ground crew to know if the pilot had extended the landing gear at night. And speaking of turns and loops and rolls, well, this is where the Yak-18T earns its keep. The plane is used by many aerobatic pilots around the world, and while it can't quite keep up with the unlimited category of aircraft such as the Extra 300 or Sukhoi 31, it's certainly enough to keep airshow crowds on their feet with finesse. The Yak-18T manual is so rich in details, it actually has instructions on how to perform aerobatic maneuvers. Aerobatic pilot Alan Cassidy flew his Yak with his family on board to a competition, dropped them off to watch him perform, won the competition, and then picked up his family for the flight back home. Try that in your pitch special. So, have I sold you on the Yak-18T? Think you're ready to pull out your checkbook? Not so fast. The 18T was built for a very specific mission in a very specific country and a very specific environment. If you're the average weekend warrior who occasionally rents a Piper Cessna and wants to hop in and go for a quick ride around the pattern, you better hold your horses. There's a lot of little quirks to be found, and you're going to have to learn them all. For starters, well, let's talk about the starter. The 18T starter is a very typical Russian design. It uses compressed air to turn the engine. This compressed air is stored in a bottle, and you get about 5 chances to start the engine. Well, because if you don't, you better look around the airport for some more compressed air. The same compressed air system also powers the landing gear, brakes, and flaps, which is even more reason you don't want to run out of air at a bad time. A leaky air system is one of the challenges a new 18T owner faces. The elevator trim uses a small crank by your knee, and there's no trim indicator, so you just have to remember how many times you cranked in either direction. In the Western Hemisphere, radial engine ownership is primarily limited to owners of warbirds, old cargo planes, or crop dusters. So the average general aviation pilot is in for some surprises when they find themselves in a plane with a big, fire-breathing radio in front of them. Before you try to fire it up, you better make sure there's no oil left on the bottom of the engine, or you could be in for a very expensive mistake. And once you've got that engine fired up, you better be in no hurry to go anywhere, as you'll wait for the oil to warm up. So, take your time to enjoy the wonderful sounds of that big radio. If you find yourself in an 18T with all the original equipment from the factory, you'll find the cockpit looks nothing like your average Cessna 172, and you're going to have to get quite used to the instruments that look like they were designed by Joseph Stalin. Both manifold pressure and prop speed are measured in percent. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just different, that's all. With the flap lever, there's 2 settings, on or off, and the flaps are very large, so it's mostly used as a speed brake on final approach. The steering is another stroke of Russian genius, or quirkiness, however you see it. Again, this is not your flight school Cessna. To turn, you squeeze the handbrake, which compresses the air, and then you push a rudder pedal to turn. Just one more thing to get used to. The good news is, this is very common on many Russian planes, so once you've mastered the Yak-18T on the ground, you just might be ready for the massive Antonov AN-2 biplane. 18T will get off in the ground in a hurry thanks to its 360 horsepower engine and has a climb rate of almost 1,000 feet per minute. Pilots report that the controls are very responsive, making the 18T enjoyable to crank and bank. But the unique wing arrangement also ensures a nice, comfortable ride if your mission is flying along in straight lines between destinations. Think of a muscle car and a family SUV, all rolled into one. Speaking of going places, that's probably the biggest drawback to this plane. For a plane that's roughly the size of a Piper Saratoga, the cruise speed is more in line with the Piper Cherokee, especially if you want to squeeze in as much range as you can. While it's capable of flying up to 160 miles per hour, you'll have to ease it down to around 120 if you plan to fly longer distances, and this will give you a range of about 400 nautical miles. Plan to burn around 13 gallons an hour while cruising along at that speed. Oh, and let's not forget, this is an old school radio engine, so Make sure you fill that oil tank every couple flights. Think the Yak might be a little too Russian for your style? You're not alone. Many modifications have been made to make it a little more enjoyable for the casual flyer. These modifications not only made the AT&T more civilized, but enhanced its capabilities too. While 360 horsepower is more than plenty for your average pilot, many were upgraded to 400 horsepower, and some even had 450 horsepower. While the extra horses won't make it go faster, for aerobatic competitions it really packed a punch. The old school propeller on the Yak AT&T is a throwback to its Aeroflot pilot training roots, with two fat blades made out of wood. These props were commonplace on Soviet trainers. Many pilots forgot to lower the landing gear when coming into land. The blades were designed to snap off like twigs on gear-up landings. By doing this, the engine was spared from major damage, and the blades could be easily replaced. They complement the Yak AT&T well as far as looks, and their low-frequency humming sound really adds to the plane's old-school character. But for hardcore duties like aerobatics, a modern carbon fiber propeller like the MT or Whirlwind are much better choices for those looking to bump up performance. They're much lighter, produce more thrust, and less vibration. And for pilots used to traditional Western-built engines, they'll be surprised to find they have to push the left rudder when taking off. The M14s turn counterclockwise. Another shortcoming of the AT&T was the range. Granted, most of these planes were used for training and likely didn't stray far from the airport. So, adding more fuel tanks for the extra range is another popular option that makes the plane far more useful. We all know that aerobatic pilots love to fly upside down. Well, the AT&T could only do this for a couple seconds before the engine would sputter out. Many owners modded their engines with inverted oil and fuel systems, especially for those into serious aerobatics. As can be expected from Soviet-era machinery, the accommodations were quite industrial, with simple tube and fabric seats. As they got old and worn out, these were replaced with luxurious leather upholstery, custom tailored for those who want to fly in style. And other owners replaced the antiquated flat windscreen with a rounded single-piece windscreen. If that didn't help increase speed, at least it looked faster. Extra soundproofing has also been installed. After all, some passengers may not enjoy that wonderful radio sound like we av geeks do. The Soviet-issue avionics and radios have also been upgraded with modern avionics, easing up pilot load and making ownership more enjoyable. Production of the AT&T ended in 1989, but some die-hard fans felt the plane was too good to die. So in the early 1990s, a British company led by veteran aerobatic pilot Richard Good partnered up with Russian manufacturer Technoavia and built a handful of AT&Ts, which were renamed the SM-94. These were modernized with larger engines, smooth windshields, and extra fuel tanks for added range. Technoavia kept on pushing the AT&T design to its limits, perhaps as a way to make it more appealing to buyers in the West who might have considered buying a Piper Malibu instead. It was modified with a modern-looking square tail, and seating was increased to 6 passengers. But the most extreme mod was replacing the radio engine with a turboprop. Proof that anything could be powered with a turboprop, I guess. I believe these latest versions remain as prototypes. Good thing for Pilatus and TBM, right? So by now, I bet you're dying to know how much it costs to own this legend from Russia. I'm glad you asked. It turns out that you can get quite a bargain if you shop around. Expect to pay anywhere from $65,000 to $115,000 for an AT&T in decent shape. I mean, what else can you buy in that price range? Just keep in mind, you'll need to hook up with a parts supplier, plus a mechanic familiar with the M14 radio engine, unless you work on it yourself. If you ask around, you'll find specialists who can give you some peace of mind when you're ready to drop some dough on an AT&T, or need to source parts for the M14. Richard Good Aerobatics is a good source, and Richard himself is considered one of the top specialists in Russian aerobatic aircraft, having not only flown in many types, but possesses a vast knowledge of their systems and parts. Richard was responsible for many of the Yak AT&T's upgrades, and remains a valuable source of knowledge for current or future owners. If you can get past all the quirks and demands of this flying legend, you'll be rewarded with a plane that's well-rounded for cross-country flights with your friends, is fully capable of aerobatic maneuvers, but best of all, earns you bragging rights everywhere you land. Well, that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that, and I want to thank the following channels for making this video possible. Feel free to share your thoughts about the aircraft featured today. And by the way, if there's an aircraft that you want me to cover in an upcoming video, just drop it in the comments below. There's a ton of material to go over for new videos. See you next time.